Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Hey Mike, we are ready for our next episode of From Our Generation to yours. And we left last time, we were talking about the island and private property and the importance of private property rights. And also we were talking about the instituting of government on the island. And what I think I'd like to do is I want to be jumping around in history, but I also want to always, when we're jumping around in history, I want to refer back to the principles of the island, especially when we get to human nature, because the one constant throughout history, and it doesn't really matter what part of the world or what point in time, is human nature determined what the circumstances were. And so we're going to be talking about that. And but what I'd like to do is jump from the island to the formation of our country. And we mentioned this on the last podcast for just a bit, and that is that after the Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies negotiated and signed onto the Articles of Confederation. And they thought that was going to be great and it was going to last for a long time. And the Articles of Confederation lasted for 5 years. And then everybody knew this is not working. We have to do something different.
Well, it took them a while even to just get agreement on it before it started working for a little bit and then quit.
Yeah, took 3 years. Took 3.5 years from the time that the people who negotiated it and voted for it. It took 3.5 years for the 13 colonies to ratify it. So you're right.
Yeah.
And then it lasted for 5 years. And so then they convened in Philadelphia, and virtually everybody who was coming from the 13 colonies thought they were coming to amend the Articles of Confederation. And by the way, I would encourage our listeners, the Articles of Confederation are not long. It will take you maybe 30 minutes to read them. I would encourage people to go back and read them and say, I can understand why they were not sufficient.
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, and then the question is, what were these smart people thinking at the time that they thought it would work?
Yeah, and I'm going to say that what they thought is that people would all act the way they ought to.
Oh, that is a penetrating point.
Yeah.
Because, one of the quotes from Machiavelli that we saw, and that's 15th century, I believe, 16th century in the 1500s, where he said, if you end up hurting yourself if you act like people, if you think people should act instead of the way they do act.
Yeah, yeah.
If you depend on the way they should act instead of the way they do act.
Right.
I think is the way to say it.
Yeah, and so all 13 colonies, for example, had the right to coin money. And so they all came up with their own little different ways of creating inflation within their own colonies, and so it wasn't working. There were all kinds of trade disputes, and they figured out if we don't do something, we're going to end up being at war with each other, just like Europe had been at war throughout the ages. Spain fighting France, and both fighting England and Germany, and there are Prussia. So the colonists said, we don't want that.
Well, one way of looking at the Civil War is that turned the United States with a small u and a small s. It was a united group of sovereign states.
Well, you mean the Revolutionary War, not the Civil War.
No, I mean the Civil War,
okay.
Because it started out as a sovereign states that had a compact, a kind of a loose affiliation. It got a lot stronger in the Civil War, where we became a national entity, where things became much more centralized and run out of Washington over time. So one way of looking at that, and one of our quotes in our series on war that we did later, is that the United States went from a small u and a small s to a big U and a big S. Anyway, it's about centralization.
Yes, yeah. And but the Articles of Confederation, we went from there to everybody from the colonies. Every colony sent representatives to Philadelphia. They thought they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation.
I think that was a declared mission of the convention.
Yeah, James Madison and Hamilton believed that we needed to scrap that document and come up with a brand new one. Ultimately, the people of Philadelphia drafted the U.S. Constitution. Now, when they drafted the U.S. Constitution, it was eventually then ratified not by every colony, but by 9 of the 13, and then eventually all 13. But part of what they said in their drafting of it was it would require 2/3 vote in order to be ratified.
Right.
And so eventually the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th ratified it. But once 9 did, then the Constitution became the law of the land. And the Constitution did not have at that time, it didn't have the Bill of Rights. That came shortly thereafter. And what's also interesting, and we'll get into this in future podcasts, is the Bill of Rights, as we know it, the first 10 amendments, there were actually something like 20 to 22 amendments that were offered, and only 10 made the cut. And we'll talk about some of the ones that didn't make the cut as we talk about how the people who were trying to institute our government, how they were thinking and what they were trying to do in order to have a constitution that would serve us for a long period of time. And the one thing that we can absolutely look back on and say is that the Constitution has served our country for a very, very long period of time. And there's been stresses on the Constitution. As you point out, the Civil War was a tremendous stress on the Constitution, almost divided the country.
And there were several amendments to the Constitution that came out of that period.
As a result of that.
Right.
And we'll get into that too. But what I want to do today is I kind of want to flip forward to very current events because what you have now with the new Trump administration and the Republicans in control of the House and the Senate, when Trump ran for office, he said that he was going to dramatically cut spending, especially on the regulatory state. He made it very clear he was not going to touch Social Security or Medicare. Now, we're going to be talking about Social Security and Medicare and what their impact has been on the federal budget, just so that our audience knows that. And but what you're already seeing is some evidence that the other parts of the budget are going to be looked at and perhaps cut substantially. So I've got some slides here, Mike, just to kind of give people a history. And the first one we're going to look at is government total expenditures, and this goes back a long, long way. But you can see that the government expenditures grew at a fairly constant rate, but then all of a sudden, sometime around that 1980 period, it started to accelerate and grow ever faster. And this is where the problem is. Government spending now, federal spending as a percentage of our GDP now is approaching 25%. For the last 30 years, it has ranged around 20%. And so we have a spending problem. How it's addressed, we'll discuss that. And then the second graph that we're going to look at, and people can go back and look at these graphs as they choose to, but the second graph that we're going to look at is the interest expense. And what you can see in the time period right before the spike, which started around 2020, what you can see is that even as the debt increased, the amount we paid on interest for about a 20-year period didn't increase a lot, and that's because interest rates were so incredibly low. Yes. And from a historical standpoint, they were lower than they were before, and that they will likely be again. And so you could say that we now are going to have to pay for the government that we have through higher interest rates than the one that I think were artificially pushed down for about 20 years.
Well, for people for whom this is not living memory, who've lived through basically this stable, very low interest rate environment,
right,
it may be worth saying when Susan and I married, I think our first mortgage was about 12%.
Okay.
I think that was a variable mortgage because we didn't
Now, about what year was that?
That was 1982 when we bought that house. We married in 81. I was in business school, so actually it was 84 when we bought that house.
And 12%.
12%.
Yeah. Now, if you go back just 2 years before that, the mortgage rate would have been 16 to 17% because that was where it peaked. And that was right after that period where I went to the Conference on International Reform.
Right.
And in 1979.
And we're persuaded by every point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And so as you point out, interest rates were very high, inflation was very high, and then in the mid 80s, interest rates came down to a normalized number. Where they've been very, very low, artificially low, has been since 2008, where you had the kind of what they now call the Great Recession. Interest rates were then kept down for about 15 years.
And by that we mean, 2 or 3%, and in some cases they were negative.
Yes.
At some brief periods, interest rates pay you to store your money.
Right, and the Fed had interest rates depending on the maturity of anywhere from 0.5% to as high as only 1.5% to 2%, which was just artificially low. But our next graph is a graph on the history of Medicare, and what we're doing is Medicare passed in the late 1960s, and so this graph starts in 1970, and it goes up to 2023. And so what I want to pay close attention to is the period from about 1990 to 2010. So what you're looking at there is you see a steep increase. You see a very steep increase in the rate of spending. And what was going on there was the provider side of the business was learning how to take advantage of the system. The provider side was learning how to take advantage of the system.
Meaning they were doing what was legal, what was legally permissible.
Yes.
They weren't criminals. They were just figuring out how to use the rules better to their advantage.
Yes. Yeah. And by the way, that when we talk about human nature, if you give large numbers of people the ability to game a system, in other words, to help themselves at the expense of others, if you give them a legal way to do that, some people will take advantage of that. And as more people learn about it, just as on the island, when the first two people divided the labor and benefited themselves in doing that, other people noticed and said, "Hey, that's good. Let's do that. We can do that too." And so that's what's happened. And by the way, that's been going on now in all of the entitlement systems. It's been going on ever since. And we're going to be digging into our healthcare system in great detail and talking about the foundations on which it is built. And then we're going to be offering some solutions for people to think about that I believe are very, very outside the box because they get to what I call the essence of the problem, which is where are the real costs in the healthcare system. But this shows that Medicare just kept growing and growing and growing, and they're saying that it'll be north of $1 trillion. And by the way, just to add on, very, very soon. Yeah. In fact, may have already passed it in this year because this was 2023, and here we are now at the beginning of 2025. But I want to mention something, and so that people can understand a little bit about perspective here. From 1932 to 1945, the birth rate relative to the time period before and certainly the time period after 1945 was relatively low. So if you add 65 to 1932, you get 1998, 1999, that time period. And then for 10 years, the number of people who were turning 65 was very low on a relative basis. I call that the baby dearth generation. The baby boom generation started very rapidly. Well,
just to clarify, that was a period of depression and war.
Yes.
So it's very logical that people will be cautious about starting families.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So after the war, the soldiers came back. They're starting their educations with the GI Bill. They're building homes, like Levittown was a famous example in New York. There's this boom of home creation and babies.
Yes.
They call it the baby boom.
The baby boom.
Most of us know.
And the baby boom lasted from 1945 till 1960. So if you add 65 to 1945, you get 2010. So in 2010, the baby boom generation started to turn 65. And now we're in 2025, and so now the last of the baby boomers are now turning 65. But in a period of 60 days in 2010, the number of people who turned 65 a day jumped from 6,000 to 10,000 a day. That's how fast it jumped from the baby dearth to the baby boom. It was really, really fast. And then the other thing that we need to take into account, I'm 76, and I have been blessed with good health. Most people do not really start to stress the healthcare system until they pass 80, and sometimes it's past 85. But the oldest people in the baby boom generation right now are 80. And so they're now so Medicare is about to get stressed even more as the baby boom generation moves from not just 65 but over age 80. And so we'll need to take that into account as we think about healthcare. And I'm not talking about cutting benefits. When we start talking about healthcare, we're going to be looking at the huge cost of how the system itself, not just Medicare, the whole healthcare system, the platform that's based on is incredibly expensive. And that's what we're going to be focused on.
One thing I think is worth saying is that when Social Security was created, the average lifespan was about 65 to 68. Retirement age was 65, so they were looking at financing 1, 2, 3 years of the very end of someone's life.
Right.
I think in a century ago, in the early 1900s, the average lifespan was 50 to 60, including the averages of people that died young. So we've had a profound blessing in extra life now. Cardiology and so many other aspects of our medicine let us live longer, and in your case and many others, very much healthier lives long after 65. It's expensive. And Social Security was not originally built to anticipate that, nor was Medicare.
Right. And in fact, Larry Ellison, when he did the press conference with President Trump and Massa from SoftBank and Sam Altman from OpenAI, Larry Ellison, Oracle is very, very big in healthcare.
So he's the creator of Oracle and one of the investors in this new AI initiative.
Yes, but what he did was he said AI will allow us to identify. He said everybody's body has little minute amounts of cancer floating around in the bloodstream.
Well, cancer is an unusual cell growth. It's accelerated cell growth. If you look at it that way, it's really easy to understand that everybody has cells that are growing at an unnatural rate, but they're not yet cancer.
Right.
Or they might be considered some mini form of cancer. That's what we're saying, to keep our terminology clear.
And what he said, as long as they're small, they don't do harm.
Right.
And he said we'll be able in the near future to actually identify cancerous cells before they metastasize and become too big. Well, think what the implications are for that to extending life even another 5 or 10 years potentially. And so all of those things are things that we're going to be talking about. But I'm going to go to the next slide, and that is the slide that shows the Medicare enrollment as a percentage of the population. And this is what we were talking about earlier. This is where the baby boom generation has now turned 65, and where, as you point out, life expectancy is longer. And so the percentage of people over 65 from 2005, you can see that it's increased dramatically. And so those are the people who are on Social Security and who are on Medicare. And if life expectancy extends even farther, then that red line is going to become a higher and higher percentage. And so that's something that we will be talking about.
I think it's also useful to say, we can think of this as a burden, that people are retired and doing nothing.
Right.
But both of you and I are past retirement age. We're not exactly doing nothing. We think we're doing something that's actually pretty productive here.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people like us that have the capacity to make life better and richer. And that I think should be our task in unleashing human potential in our policies in our country.
Yeah, and to your point, I think there are a lot of people who are reaching 65 and they don't want to retire, or they do something else that is productive. But these are just trying to kind of lay the foundation of where things are, and so we'll go from there. Now the next chart is a historic and projected Medicare income and expenditures over time, only taking it up to 2030. So you can see that in the next 5 years, this graph is going to show that Medicare will go from a little over $1 trillion to close to $2 trillion. So our third-party payment systems cover all healthcare. And when I say third-party payment, it means that the patient goes into the doctor and does not pay for the service at the time that they get it. And so therefore there's this giant system that is very, very expensive to determine how much money the provider will get and whether or not the patient owes anything, and if they do, how much they owe.
And just to give a comparative example, it would be as if when we buy car insurance, every time we buy gas, somebody else pays for it.
Yes.
Every time we get an oil change, somebody else pays for it. And all the administrative expense that goes with that and making sure that you actually did it, that it was the right price, that's all built into a system that's paying for every little jot and tittle.
Right. And so to use your example, when we go to buy gasoline, we take our credit card or our debit card and we stick it in the gas pump and we pump our gas. The third-party payment system takes about 2%. So if you spent $50 buying gasoline, the third-party payment system takes $1 to move that money from your bank account to the gas station's bank account, and the transaction is over.
And that's built into the price of the gas.
And that's built into the price of the gas. But the main thing is that you know what the price of the gas is before you pump it, and you know how much it costs when you're done.
And there's no dispute afterwards and arguing over it.
Right, and there's not a whole bunch of people trying to determine whether or not you've reached your annual gas deductible. And
they call that adjudication in the healthcare world, and there's a huge throng of people adjudicating claims to see whether the right amount was paid.
Millions. And you remember on the island, we talked about non-productive behavior, which is where you are doing something that you're doing work that nobody would buy if they had a choice, where the product.
It's a great example of it.
This is a great example, but it is a system that exists for a reason, and we're going to get into those reasons a little bit later on. But we're going to continue on here, and let's go to the next graph, which is the one on Medicaid. Now this one's very, very interesting. That when Biden took office in 2020.
Let's just clarify for young people who may not know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid.
Please, go ahead.
Well, Medicare is a general health coverage that you have to go on when you retire.
Over a certain age.
Over a certain age, yes. And Medicaid is a...
And let me correct you just for a second. You said when you retire. It's actually when you reach a certain age.
Yes.
Whether you retire or not. You're going on Medicare, so please.
That's better said. I'm associating retirement with the traditional age of 65. That association is loosening. If you retire early, you're not eligible for Medicare. So it is basically old person's health care. It's not particularly voluntary.
It's not voluntary at all.
Yeah. If you have a spouse that's still working, I think you can delay it and not take it. But basically, they force you on it.
Yes.
And Medicaid now is a poverty-related program. It varies by state because much of the funding comes through the states, and we can get into how the federal government coerces states to do this, which is a very interesting topic for me. But it is basically oriented toward the poorest.
Well, that was what it was originally supposed to be. So
not all cases is
right. So let's take a look at what's happened here. Because as you point out, Medicaid was supposed to be a program to help people who are poor and cannot afford health insurance. But let me talk a little bit about health insurance. Obamacare, when President Obama was pushing Obamacare in 2010, he made two promises that turned out not to be true. One was, he said, you can keep your doctor if you want to keep your doctor. And related to that is you could keep your insurance if you want to keep your insurance. Well, those didn't turn out to be true. But the other promise that he made, and this is one that actually is more impactful, was he said if Obamacare passes, the cost of insurance for the typical family will drop $2,500. The cost of insurance will drop $2,500. At that time, the typical family who is providing for their own insurance through the private sector without any subsidies was paying $10,000 a year. Now it's $25,000 a year. And so
as opposed to a prediction of 7,500?
Yes.
Am I doing my math right?
Yeah, you're doing your math right. That's how far off it is. And so it's because the cost of health care for a family of four has gone from $10,000 to $25,000. Now that has happened especially in the last 5 years. Okay, since 2020. This is when you look at this graph from 2020 to 2025, the number of people who are now on Medicaid is now grabbing a lot of people who are in what we would describe as the middle class, because healthcare at $25,000 for a family becomes unaffordable. If you're making $60,000 to $70,000, it's just unaffordable. And so consequently, people are going on to Obamacare. They're expanding Medicaid. When COVID hit, and let me say one thing as a principle. It wasn't on the island, but it is a principle, and that is when you have a dramatic or a very, very traumatic event, government seems to always increase in size and power. And so
like a war.
World War II,
Depression.
World War II is an example. The Depression was an example, and actually the Depression first, and then World War II, and then you had in the '60s you had Medicare and Medicaid were passed with the Great Society programs, but then in 2000 when you had the .com, when the bubble burst, you had a bill called Sarbanes-Oxley that was passed. And that raised the cost of being a public company and the risk of being a public company. It raised it dramatically, which also then meant that a lot of companies that could have gone public didn't because it was so expensive. And then you had the Great Recession in 2008 and 9, and you had Dodd-Frank, which then put all kinds of restrictions and regulations on the banking industry and raised the cost of being a bank depending on what size you were. But always government's always looking for ways, as Rahm Emanuel said famously. He said, in government, we never let a crisis go to waste.
And your point is it never goes back to the prior size.
Right.
It just enlarges and then enlarges again. It's a ratchet.
Right. Except for we may have that opportunity now. And what I'm saying is, in the first time in my lifetime, you actually have a public that seems to be fed up with government being too big and too expensive, and you have an administration that very well might actually want to reduce the size and power of government, which is a very unusual circumstance.
Decades ago, I went to a conference with a lot of smart people talking about one of these kind of crises, and these were scientifically oriented folks, and they talked about the I think it was the thermal cycle or something. It was basically a life cycle. We all know the bell curve. You grow, you're born, you grow really fast, you slow down, you plateau, then you decline, and then you fade out. Okay. The point was, if you're on the right shoulder of that, if you're past maturity and you're starting to decline, can you push a system back? You can't push a person back.
No.
They're going to die.
Right.
And so the question is that a natural life cycle for societies, for corporations, et cetera? Do you try to push that entity back toward a more stable structure, or do you just push it off the cliff and start with a new one, a new sprout?
Well, and what's interesting in a free market, what happens is the companies that, shall we use the word atrophy, they atrophy, they get to where they can't adjust to the new conditions.
And they fail.
Yeah, in the free,
they get replaced.
They get replaced, but they get replaced by something that offers the consumer something better.
Exactly.
And so
So do you have a life cycle like that for governments and civilizations?
And that's going to be the question. Ray Dalio wrote a book, and I don't remember the title of it, but he ran one of the greatest hedge funds. And when I say greatest hedge funds, I mean that in a very, very positive way. He invested money on behalf of pensions and endowments and whatnot, and he did very, very well. But he wrote a book about the very subject that you're talking about, is how civilizations and countries, they go through 5 phases in his thesis, and he lays it out very, very carefully in his book and shows. And he says the United States is in the 4th phase. The 5th phase is generally pretty rapid decline, and it's generally monetarily based. Is the decline.
So, I mean, let's think about the end of World War II. There were a number of economies that collapsed like this, where people were carrying cash around in wheelbarrows.
Yes.
Inflation was so much.
That was actually right before World War II. That gave the rise to Hitler. Was the hyperinflation.
Yes, you're right.
The hyperinflation in Germany was in the 20s.
It was after World War I and before World War II,
yes.
but their economies had been destabilized. It doesn't mean that everybody died. It means that their institutions broke and they had to be replaced with great stress. And so all the wealth that people had built up worth nothing.
Yes. And that was true in Germany. Then after the Second World War, it was true with Japan. And then it was true with Germany again after the Second World War. And it was true to a certain extent with Britain, because it had been devastated so much by the war, and with France, especially France after the First World War. So the point that we're making is that circumstances can change dramatically, either from specific events or from very bad policy that extends over a long period of time. The question is whether a constitutional republic such as ours can self-correct, and that's the question that you're asking, and that's the question that we're asking here.
And part of that has to do with how well-founded it is and its recognition of human nature. Back to our prior conversation about this, the founders were very articulate about this, particularly in the Federalist Papers, about men are not angels. If they were angels, we wouldn't need government. And so the Constitution and the thinking that caused it is suffused with this knowledge about human nature. That would be the tragedy of pushing over our system and starting over, because who knows how wise a group of people today would be in creating a replacement for it. Well, I'm not quite in favor of replacing it as much as trying to revive it.
Well, and revive it, not necessarily change it. Revive what's there. Well, because we may not be following what is there. And let's talk a little bit about that, because when the Constitution, when they had the convention, the one thing that they all agreed on, as we've said, is the one thing they all agreed on is the Articles of Confederation are not sufficient. We must have something different. And so what they did was, to your point about men are not angels, if they were angels, we wouldn't need government, and they're not. So then they said, okay, what can we do? Because they were, let's remember, we had just beaten Great Britain, which had a king and a parliament, and all of Europe at that time had rulers. They were not, the top people were not elected by the citizenry. And so the people who were convening, but they also were very scared of tyranny of the majority. So they were very scared of direct democracy. And so they said, we don't want to have it where a majority can, just like we talked about on the island, where the people who built the bridge,
51% can decide that we all own it together.
Yeah, that we all own it together. And so what they said was, we want to build a system where we recognize that we will have differences of opinion, but we want our differences of opinion to be handled civilly and nonviolently.
Yes.
And so we said, okay, we're going to devise a system where we give certain powers to the national government. And among those powers was only the national government could coin money. The states could not, because they had been able to with the other colonies. The colonies or the states could not create their own money.
There were really kind of 3 main pillars there. There was the common defense. There was a system of justice to settle disputes, and there was money, stable money.
Yeah, and then other laws other laws. There were certain laws that were in Article 1, Section 8 enumerates the powers that were given to Congress. And for 150 years, the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court in combination held very closely to Article 1, Section 8. In fact, it's very interesting. In the 1950s, the interstate highway system was funded by Congress and signed by Eisenhower. But in order to do it, they felt that they did not feel that they had the right under the Constitution to have an infrastructure program. So our interstate highway system was funded under the Defense Department. And the logic was, if we get into a war, we will need to be able to move troops and equipment rapidly around our country.
So Eisenhower had been in Europe, and the Autobahn had been built, as I understand it, at least parts of what we now think of as the Autobahn. They're high-speed highways.
Yes.
Wouldn't be interstate in Germany. But he came back here and he actually set up an experiment. How long would it take to get a platoon or equipment or whatever from San Francisco to Washington? I think it took him 35 days or something.
A long time.
Yeah. He said, this is unacceptable. And so the interstate system was designed for nominally the purpose of defense, but also has a tremendous commercial application.
Sure.
Just like NASA has had its purpose, but also tremendous commercial benefit and inventions that came from it. But one thing I find real interesting about interstates, have you ever noticed when you're driving that the interstate almost always goes under a bridge of a local road?
I've not really paid much attention to that, but
that was an intentional design, because if you bomb out a bridge, the road's inoperable. And they did not want the main artery to be bombed. So it did not go over other roads. It went under them.
That's interesting. That's a new one for me.
Now, in cities, that changes, right? Because you don't have the room to do this. And so in a lot of cities, interstates now are on
right,
above.
But your point is well taken. When you're going across country, it's always going under.
Yeah, and you could fix a hole in the ground much faster than you can fix a bridge.
Yeah. And now another interesting point is, and I don't know the specifics of this, but when you're going across the country on an interstate, there's a certain within certain distances, the interstate has to be straight for a certain period of distance so that planes can land. They wanted to be able to use the interstates to land planes, and so when they designed the interstates, they said it has to act like a runway. It has to be straight. It has to be a certain distance, and that has to happen in certain intervals.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
And last year I was in Washington, D.C. and went to the Ford's Theater and struck up a conversation with a ranger there, and he asked me, "Have you noticed how wide the roads are around here in Washington?" I said, "No, they're like 8 lanes wide." And there are a lot of traffic circles. He said, "Do you ever think about why?" And he said, the reason is the designer of Washington, D.C. was French. And you know, when they have a revolution in France, what do? To the barricades. That means you block off the roads. They did not want those roads blocked off, so they made them very wide. And they also put traffic circles there, roundabouts, we might call them. That was not for the fun of driving around in circles. It was to put guns in the middle of those roads that could point in any direction they needed to point.
Wow. And that's a fascinating little bit of history.
It's so fascinating to see things anew that you've been seeing all along. We live here in Middle Tennessee, and we drive through these interstates that are cut through hills because it's such a hilly terrain here. And you look in the side of those hills, and there's horizontal stripes there. If you notice that, the rocks are in layers.
Yes, okay.
That means they were formed under an ocean, not by magma that comes up from a volcano that looks more solid. But if they're in layers, that means it happened like tree rings. Year after year after year, there was sediment that got pushed down and then formed into rock.
Okay.
So that's how they figured out how old the world really is when they started understanding this rock is accumulated very slowly and then gets pushed up into mountain ranges.
Interesting. Okay, well,
all the stuff about tectonics and all that comes from that. But anyway, the point is seeing something you've passed for years and years and years, and suddenly seeing new meaning in it. Just fascinating. Fun.
It's a sense of wonder, and that's kind of what I'm hoping that we can get our listeners to.
We have plenty of years to have accumulated those stories.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to go back to this chart here on Medicaid. and look at the dramatic increase. And by the way, this is a time where when Biden took office, unemployment was about 6.5%. And by the time he left office, it was 4.1%. And the claim was that the economy was really great. Well, if the economy was really great, then why are more and more people getting on Medicaid? And we answered that in part by saying healthcare costs have gone up so much, so consistently, and especially in the last 5 years, that the so-called right to health care now is becoming an enormous burden on the economy. And you can see that Medicaid increased from $600 billion to closing in on $1 trillion in just 5 years. and that doesn't count Obamacare. Obamacare is even separate from this. But here's part of the thing that's interesting. And Mike, you brought this up a little earlier, but I'm going to take a little bit different tack than the way that you described it with the states, because the states only put up a little bit of Medicaid and the federal government pays the rest. So it's about 2 to 1. States put up $1 and the federal government will give $2. With Obamacare, it's even greater. The states put up a dime and the federal government puts up 90 cents. And so here's what the states have figured out how to do. California and New York in particular. They impose taxes on their healthcare providers to generate the revenue so that they can then spend their share of Medicaid. Then, because Medicaid is controlled at the state level, they then raise the amount that the providers can collect from Medicaid, so that they get this 2 to 1 coming back to them. And so they've learned how to game the system. Now,
so
some
this is
people,
a plausible explanation for what happened in that step around 2010 as they figured this out.
yes, and that's true with Obamacare, and it's true with Medicaid. And both of those will have to be addressed if we're going to be able to get our country back on good, strong fiscal footing. If you don't address those, it's not going to be possible to do that. And so what I want to do now is talk just very briefly about our healthcare system and how it works. And so let's just walk through it very quickly. If we go to the doctor's office, the doctor will say, the nurse or person there at the desk will say, Mr. Hassel, you have a $35 copay. And you pay your $35 copay. And you go see the doctor. And then you go home. And the doctor has a very expensive electronic medical record where the doctor inputs everything that the doctor did while you were there. And then that electronic medical record is then sent to what is their third-party billing company, which is generally an independent company that then interfaces with all the different insurance companies or Medicare, Obamacare, Medicaid, where you are paid. And then that billing company takes that electronic medical records and makes sure that you have coded everything properly, or the doctor has coded everything, dotted every I and crossed every T. And if the medical record company says this is good, they then send it to the third-party payer, which might be a private insurance company. It might be a private insurance company handling the payment for Obamacare or Medicaid or Medicare. Or it may just be the government, which does it. And then they then look at it, and if it's a private insurance, if something's not right, they kick it back, or if it's Medicare, they kick it back. So there's a cost involved in that part. But if you're in private insurance, the next thing you get is a piece in the mail that is called an EOB.
Explanation of benefits.
Explanation of benefits, and that's the first time.
You know what the price is?
That you find out what the so-called price is.
Yeah.
So it might say that doctor was trying to charge you $240, but the insurance company has reduced it to $140.
And they paid $80.
And then you've paid.
And they've written off $50 and you owe $5. Some numbers like that.
Well, no.
I've seen those. They're ridiculous. They're nothing like any regular pricing you'd see.
Well,
in
now you're talking about Medicare now. I'm talking about
my insurance. Well, my EOBs.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is, if it's what I just said, if it's $250 negotiated down to $140, and it says this is not a bill, do not pay.
Right.
Then later you'll get a bill, and it says the 250 negotiated down to 140. It'll subtract your 35, and then if you've not met your annual deductible, it bills you for the $105.
Okay.
And then if you pay the $105, it's over. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of things that have happened with me because years ago, our company had, in fact, it was when you and I worked together, we had a medical savings account. And my wife, Kathy, wanted to have a bunion taken off her foot. And she wanted to have it taken off at the beginning